My name is Brandon Gaddafi, and I am here for the podcast interview with Mr. Du Bois, the diplomat in residence at Spelman College, and I will ask him a few questions.
Hello, hi Brandon. I'm Alan DuBose. I'm the diplomat in resident here at Spelman College, and I am a U.S. State Department Foreign Service generalist. I'm not an economist, but I have a good understanding of globalization, which is what we're planning on talking about for this academic interview.
Question number 1, what is globalization?
Okay. Globalization is basically an attempt to eliminate trade barriers. And we've been having trade ever since the beginning of time. Back when we had barter, before we even had money, we had trade. And over time, it just kind of organically developed. We heard of the Silk Road that goes back thousands of years and other concepts of trade.
In Asia.
Exactly. So what they did, I think it was, I actually have it written down, 1947 was the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs and Trade, which is they call the GATT. And the GATT agreement was the first really organized, structured agreement of its major size, where they tried to bring all the countries together with some sets of rules to improve trade and also reduce tariffs. Mm-hmm. That was followed up by the World Trade Organization more recently, where they have tried to focus a little bit more on domestic issues that inhibit trade. So GATT focused on reducing tariffs so countries could trade, and the World Trade Organization is doing the same thing, but following up a little bit more with some of the barriers that might exist, even with those other barriers being reduced. So it's pretty much evolving. I can go into a little more detail about globalization. As I said, it's an attempt to eliminate trade barriers so people can get products and services a lot more easily or a lot more efficiently. So what does that mean? What that means is that in economics, we have efficient allocation. If we have 3 people doing the same thing, we would say that's probably not an efficient allocation of their work.
Correct.
So globalization says, why don't we have each person do something different, and then they trade with each other, so the people who are doing the other 2 things that you're not doing, you can get from them. And that's what the economists consider more efficient. One of the reasons they consider it more efficient is because it focuses on specialization. And specialization, the assumption is anytime you're specializing anything, you get better at it. So if someone is doing 3 things instead of just 1 thing, they may be able to accomplish those 3 things, but the person who's focused on just doing those 1 things tends to get better and better and better, because that is what they're focused on, and they're learning every time they do whatever this act is. They're learning how to be more and more and more efficient at it, whereas the person doing 3 things, only 1/3 of their time is spent on that specific item.
Mm-hmm. The second question is, how does globalization affect trade?
Well, again, what the economists were trying to do, or the world economies were trying to do, is take advantage of the fact that we don't necessarily need to try to do everything within our own borders. We can go somewhere else and get it from another country, maybe cheaper, or more efficiently. So what globalization does as far as trade is, 1, it makes it imperative. It forces countries now to sit down at a table and come to an agreement of some sort, because instead of them being able to develop or produce products or services within their own borders efficiently, they're pretty much giving that up through globalization. They're saying, we're not going to do those other 2 things, or we're going to do them at such a low level that it's not going to support our demand. So hypothetically, If we have a country that produces widgets, and economists always like to talk about widgets. So you have a country that produces widgets. Well, in your country, maybe you need 100 widgets a day, but you don't want to spend your time producing widgets because there are other things that are more important to you. So what you may do is you only may internally produce 10 widgets a day. That means you have to get that other 90 through globalization, through trade. It's now forcing you to have an agreement with some other countries that produce widgets very efficiently. And the logic is that it's cheaper and more efficient for you, instead of trying to build a widget industry, to go buy those other 90 widgets and import them into your country. So it requires everybody to pretty much work together. So let's see. As such, I'm just checking my notes. As such, it increases logistics. It increases other businesses that we really didn't focus on in the past. We thought about manufacturing, but now it's more of a process that can be assembly. So, for example, if someone's going to make a car, the steel may be produced in one country for it. That steel may go to a different country where they shape it into different forms. And then it may go to a third country where they finish it and paint it and prepare it. And then it goes to another country for final assembly. So you could have different parts coming from different places, all based on whatever country says we're going to be very, very efficient at this one thing. And that's why you will see sometimes made in the USA or made in Switzerland or made in China, and other times you'll see assembled in Mexico or assembled in Pakistan, because what they're doing is basically saying, we're not making the claim that all these products came from this country, we're just making the claim that it was finally assembled, the final product came from that country.
The third question that I have is, what are the challenges of globalization?
Well, this is something that's a little bit of common sense. If you stop and think about this, is the number one challenge is going to be, since globalization forces all the countries to have agreements, what do you do if someone doesn't agree? You now have a problem. So one of the major challenges with globalization is getting all the countries to agree to a set of rules. And of course, this doesn't ever really happen. So what happens is there's compromise involved. And that compromise usually involves the most powerful countries who dominate economically the world having rules that may be a little more lenient for them, because everybody recognizes that if they don't allow these other countries that are more powerful to have the rules be a little more lenient for them, then they may step out and try to do things on their own. Now, could they actually do things on their own? No, but what they could do is they could have their own bilateral agreements. So in our widget example, if all the countries get together and decide what they're going to do about widgets, and this major country says, I think this is too restrictive for me, hypothetically, what they could do is just say, I'm not going to be part of this agreement, I'm just going to stand alone, and I know I can find some country that's going to sell widgets to me, because that's money for them. And so these trade organizations, when they negotiate with each of these countries, have to deal with the fact that even though every country may be a member, some in reality have more economic power than others, and they have a little more control over exactly what those rules are going to be within that organization. Think of it like at the United Nations, where they have countries that have veto power and other countries don't. If they took that away, those countries may secede from the United Nations, and then it falls apart. So that's one of the challenges with globalization, is finding something that everybody's going to agree to, when we know you never get everybody to agree with everything. Another challenge of globalization is the protectionism in the form of subsidies or other ways. So yeah, the concept was we were going to get away from tariffs, and it did happen a lot, but it doesn't mean tariffs don't exist. And so countries still have tariffs. If they don't necessarily have tariffs, they may use subsidies. So if they know that they have a product that is popular in their country, they want to produce, but it may be produced cheaper somewhere else, they may not give up and say, oh, we'll just cede that work to this other country or these other countries. What the government may do is say to those local producers, we're going to subsidize you. So if it costs you 10 cents per widget and it costs those other countries 8 cents per widget, we know the world is going to go to them to buy, so we're going to pay you 2 cents per widget. So it brings your cost down, and now you're competitive with the rest of the world. Well, that kind of goes counter to the concept of efficient allocation of services, right? Or production. So that's one of the challenges. Now, why would they do that? Because politics gets involved. So when you're a leader in a country and your people are saying this isn't fair and we produce as well as anybody else, we're good widget makers, they're looking at it from their viewpoint, and they put pressure on their government leaders, and those government leaders realize that to keep their people happy and probably help their economy as well, short term at least, that they have to do something to make it competitive. If they were powerful enough, they might be able to get these agreements written with a little leniency. But if they're not powerful enough to do that, or they choose to not try to do it through the organization, they can use subsidies. And subsidies is a way of kind of leveling everything, but it goes counter to the concept of globalization. So that's one of the challenges with globalization for keeping it efficient. Another thing is the dirty work. So unfortunately, what we're seeing as globalization shakes out is we have manufacturing. For example, the U.S. has a lot of manufacturing, but it's not what we call the manufacturing of the old days. I'm going to use the term clean manufacturing, dirty manufacturing. If you're making chips for computers, that's clean manufacturing. It doesn't have a lot of waste. It's not hurting the environment. Dirty manufacturing would be iron ore production, steel production, things like that we think of in the old days, where you see the pictures of smoke coming out of the smokestacks. Well, through globalization, a lot of the dirty manufacturing has left the U.S. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. It just means that it's left the U.S. So where is it going? So what has started to happen is certain countries have accepted the job of being the dirty manufacturers for the world, which means it's affecting them as far as their land, their air, their water is negatively being affected. Well, this is one world, so even if one country is being negatively affected, the problems go beyond their borders as well. And you'll read about in the oceans plastic floating around, garbage that's going up on beaches, or you'll hear about sometimes gray skies in one country that's being caused by a country next door or hundreds of miles away. That's because there's such a concentration of the dirty manufacturing in that one area. So these are some of the challenges people think about or don't think about. And the last one I'm going to mention doesn't mean it's the last one, but akin to the protectionist sort of thought of subsidies is organized crime. Essentially, what is organized crime? At any time you're talking about organized crime, whenever we have any organized business, there are rules. That's why we have tax rules, we have trade rules. Those are the rules. Well, organized crime of any kind is simply going around the rules. And those rules are there for many reasons, but one of them is for competition. Another is to ensure quality of whatever it is you're producing. So we have rules for maybe manufacturing paint that won't include lead. Well, lead can actually provide some benefits to paint, but the world has decided the negative effects of lead in paint are more important than the benefits to paint. So they have rules that say you can't manufacture paint with lead. Well, what does organized crime do? They don't care. They're going to manufacture that paint with lead, then they're going to sell it cheaper. People are going to be happy with the quality of the paint until they start having problems with their kids with brain damage. That's happened because of that paint. So that organized crime has gone around the rules, and it may seem innocent to some people, but the reality is the rules are there for a reason. And by going around these rules, it chops against that concept of globalization, because now you can't always depend on having the most efficient manufacturer when you're going to some country if you know that the country you're buying from is very lax with organized crime. So you don't know if your resource is really a good supplier or if they're producing something that's low quality. So those are just some of the challenges to globalization.
And when you say organized crime, that's not necessarily like a mob. It could be like a company as well who's just not as well regulated by the government. Is that correct?
Yes, that's a very good way of phrasing it. It could be that they're not as regulated. It could be that the rules just aren't enforced because the rules may exist, but this country chooses not to enforce them. It could be something, again, we talk about clean versus dirty. Intellectual property rights is a major issue, because with service economies, they're not producing something you can touch. They're producing videos, they're producing movies, they're producing literature, they're producing research. So imagine if you wrote a book that came from your head and you wrote it down, but someone got an advanced copy of it and was able to print it and get it to market before you. You're not going to make any money because they are the ones who are going to make the money off it. That would fall in that crime category because they have stolen your intellectual property. So that's a simplistic way of looking at it, but that happens all the time in certain parts of the world because their leadership chooses to look the other way because they recognize this is helping their economy. But again, organized crime, it keeps us from having efficient allocation, which is what the economists envisioned when they talked about the concepts of globalization.
And how is this intellectual property different from manufacturing?
Manufacturing, you have we'll talk about our widgets. You're going to have whatever it is, and it's a lot easier to control someone who's making something that's fake. Intellectual property is a lot harder. How do you prove that this comes from you? Also, if we have someone who's corrupt, what they can do is steal all your work and then produce their own. So let's say you are trying to figure out how to develop an upgrade to a certain software. And you're working on this, and you spend thousands of dollars working on this, and you finally, after years and years, figure out how to do it. Well, one of the people who works for your company sells that to someone who's an intellectual property spy for another country. That person gives them money, takes that information back to their home country. They have just saved 3, 4, 5 years of work by paying off one person. And now they can produce the same thing it took you 3, 4, 5 years to produce. So even if it is something that is a physical or dirty sort of product, making it competitive efficient often is a clean thing. That's the intellectual part. It's like the car manufacturer the engineers sitting around designing the cars. That's the clean part. That's the intellectual property side of it. The actual assembly and manufacturing might be a little more dirty, but they need the clean part first, the intellectual property part first, to be able to do the other part. So if anything is corrupted in that process through organized crime, then it provides a benefit to the organized crime organization or the country that allows for it, because they don't have to put in the time doing the research. They don't have to put in the money, the effort, or anything like that, and they can still generate income.
And as time has progressed and technology progressed with it, the importance of intellectual technology and its value has increased, and therefore the benefit of stealing this work has increased, and the result is that intellectual property is being stolen more today. Would you agree with that?
I've never looked at any numbers, but common sense would say everything you just said is correct,
Right.
especially since who's the biggest producer of intellectual property? It's the U.S. and then probably Western European countries after them. So they are producing more and more services. So I guess my point is the big producers of intellectual property through globalization have gone away from the dirty manufacturing work and focus more on the services. Services is supported by intellectual development. So the intellectual property has become even more important to these countries that were good at it than it was 50, 60 years ago. So again, those countries that choose to let organized crime get involved, if they can get their hands on that information, they can develop it very, very quickly. And they're very good at manufacturing, but they don't necessarily have the design capabilities that they're real good at. But once they get the information they need to be able to manufacture, they can do it very, very well because that is their specialty.
So how do the U.S. and Western European countries protect their intellectual property? Is there any mechanisms in place that has been developed as time progresses?
These are where we start to see the trade issues and economics overlap with the relationships between governments. We talked about the GATT agreement, the World Trade Organization. This is where sometimes the United Nations gets involved. This is where we have agreements between different countries. Police get involved because they're trying the information we may know that Western Europeans countries' information is being stolen. It's not really affecting us, but if our police see it, we want to be able to do for this European country what the European country would do for us. So again, we all have to work together to work against the organized crime. It sounds fairly simple if countries make agreements, but the reality is countries are not monolithic. They're a group of people. And so people within a country basically don't care about those rules because they're looking out for themselves, which is why it's so important for the government to have rules of law. The rule of law is hugely important to a country because when their leaders sign documents with the World Trade Organization or with the police, we have to feel confident they're going to stick by those. So even if you have a leadership, your government, that agrees to the rules, if they turn the other way when some of their citizens break those rules, it undermines the whole concept.
It's interesting when you mention the rule of law because I know that is directly associated with democracy. And that is an aspect, a feature that democracies must have. It's like an essential quality of it. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I just made that connection because I am a political science major. That's one of the things that we study. And the fourth question is, what are the benefits of globalization?
Well, before I answer that question, I'm gonna say something about democracy because you made that connection with poli-sci. Yes. And poli-sci/government is very closely associated with economics. And you can't separate them. They just merge too much together. So some people in political science like to focus on the qualitative, but they have to have a rudimentary understanding of economics because they do go hand in hand. And the reality is that if you have a full and true democracy where it's just a vote yes or no, whoever gets the most votes wins, you could have an oppressive society. You could have winner take all way of thinking where the citizens of that country who lost by one vote now get nothing.
An electoral democracy.
Well, there are a whole bunch of ways of trying to get around this, but the reality is the purest form of democracy could be oppressive. But what could keep it from being oppressive is economics. is that if in this purest form it's done badly, they could make a law so they're not breaking the law because they're the majority.
Correct.
But then when they try to apply it, it could be working only to the advantage of 51 people, whereas the 49 people, it's working to their disadvantage to the point where it hurts everybody because those 49 people are going to react. They may start to steal. They may start to get aggressive. They may start to do a lot of things, whereas in a true democracy, you have to have enough sense or enough wherewithal to recognize that when you make rules for the rule of law that you're going to follow, that they're fair and just for everybody, so people have equal opportunity. And if they have equal opportunity, even though they will point the finger and say this isn't fair, if they have equal opportunity, then what else can you do? Mm-hmm. And that will tend to pull people in the middle towards the rule of law. Even if they're not doing individually well, they will still accept the rule of law because they know I have a goal I can aspire to. But if you're in a country where you know no matter what you do, those laws are written not to your advantage, you can't break in to that upper class, that upper ruling class, and that's because they built it that way. They've built it to protect themselves and hoard all the goods and services. So that's why you see some countries that are petroleum producing countries and they're poor. And then other countries that are petroleum producing countries that are very rich because they in different ways have figured out how to make their laws. But again, the rule of law is hugely important to protect citizens, but it has to be followed and they have to be fair rules.
Thank you.
All right, now I'll get back to your question. Sorry, I forgot about your question. You asked about some of the benefits?
Yes,
yeah,
sir.
We talked already about the efficient allocation of capital.
Yeah.
And that's the economists would look at that and say, it is the most efficient way to get anything done. And that's true. But this is theory. I'll give you an example. Let's say you and I we have 3 tasks we have to get done within an 8-hour period. You may be better than me at all 3 of those tasks. However, within 8 hours, you can't do all this. So even though you may be better than me at all 3 of those tasks, while you're doing task number 1, I'm better than you at task number 2 because you can't do 2 things at one time. So it is efficient for some producer to do certain tasks, even though they may not actually have the ability to be the most efficient at that task. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Because at that moment, they have the ability to do it because this other producer is busy doing something else. Well, again, that's what efficient allocation assumes. It says, yeah, we got to figure out the model that is the best way to take the strengths and maximize whatever it is we want to produce by using the efficiencies for everybody, not just for the few who are powerful, because we know they're powerful, but they can't do everything. And if they try to do everything, their efficiency goes down, which brings them down to the level of the fairly inefficient. You with me?
Yes.
So if now I'm down to the level of the fairly inefficient, I'm competing with the fairly inefficient. So why don't I just talk to the fairly inefficient and say, let's not do this. I'll do this. Even though you're not as efficient, you focus on the other tasks and we'll trade with each other. So that's the efficient allocation, but it assumes that, the benefit of globalization assumes that there are the agreements and they're going to work that way. You don't duplicate efforts, and that's what I was just talking about, is you don't have 2 people working on the same thing at semi-efficiency. You have one person working at high efficiency on that task and the other person working at high efficiency on another task, instead of them both doing both tasks at semi-efficiency. What it also does, and this is a challenge, it's a little bit peel back the onion, is it helps build industries in other countries. So some countries really are not as developed to the point where they even have the ability to develop. They just are starting with nothing, relatively speaking, and they need the outside to help them. So when the more developed countries say to this country, okay, we realize we can't send anything to you for assembly because your electrical grid won't support it. Mm-hmm. So we can't do that with you. We have to find something you can do. And that's what they look for. So if you have a country that is truly, truly underdeveloped, they can still be productive by finding something that the rest of the world needs and manufacturing that through crude means, whatever means possible. Again, for every good, there's a challenge. Let's take coffee, for example. A lot of countries that don't have a lot of technology, they produce coffee. They can grow coffee. Well, here's the catch. Everybody then tries to do it in that country. So even though the coffee from that country becomes internationally known for its high quality because they've gotten good at it, there are still a lot of people in that country who are basically flooding the market with coffee because they don't know how to do anything else. Mm-hmm. So in one sense, the globalization gives countries the opportunities to become good at something and have something they can trade with other countries. But like I said, countries aren't individuals. And when you peel back the onion to the micro, it becomes a challenge as that leader of that country to say, okay, here's a benefit we have to globalization, but now how do I make sure that other people in my country can benefit from it? Mm-hmm. We don't shoot ourselves in the foot by trying to everybody produce it, and now we've oversupplied the market, the prices go down on the coffee. Now we have coffee that's cheap, even though the quality has gone up. I think those are some of the things I have. Yep.
Thank you. Sure. So you've explained how globalization benefits countries and individuals in your example. Mm-hmm. All right. Thank you for that. The fifth question is, how does politics affect trade and globalization? And some of the challenges and benefits associated with that.
I've kind of been interspersing that answer throughout, talking about how the government leadership needs to have rule of law. They need to follow the rule of law. They can't hoard. They have to stick by the rules. They have to respect intellectual property. They have to find treaties that are equitable. One thing that I think was always envisioned is there would be less chance of war or violence from country to country if you depend on them for something. So if you are, hypothetically, you're a country that makes cars, and here's another country that produces rubber for tires, and you two don't like each other, the theory behind this was, yeah, you might not like each other, but you need each other. Mm. So you won't go to war with each other because you know as soon as you go to war against the rubber-producing country, they're not going to send you more rubber for your tires and you can't put them on your cars. That was a concept behind there. So this is where the politics can get involved, the government can get involved. It is no one way of looking at it. It's pretty much there's so many different ways that government can get involved. And then when you throw in the corruption or hoarding or not following the laws or the agreements, that makes it even more complicated. So again, remember I went back to saying poli-sci/government is really integrated with economics?
Yes.
Well, globalization is a good example of how this happens.
Yes. And another connection I made, you said that countries that depend on each other through trade are less likely to go to war with each other, but also there's a similar theory in political science that states that democracies are unlikely to go to war against each other. And part of the explanation to that is they negotiate through diplomatic means. So that's something that I thought about when you were explaining how does politics affect trade and globalization.
I hadn't thought about that, but there's just something that's definitely worth studying. Definitely. And now, one other thing I'd like to mention about politics: tribalism. So, we in the West tend to think of tribalism as the concept you see on TV of a tribe. But the reality is, tribalism in a broader sense is cliquishness. But what causes the cliquishness causes people who feel like they are the same, us against them. So when we have globalization, and this is where the politics gets involved. If you have that tribalism, when you need services and goods, you may not go to the efficient producer. You may go to someone you consider of your tribe in a different country who's not as efficient because you want to support your tribe. So that tribe could manifest itself through ethnics that cross borders between countries. It could be religious tribalism, where certain religious groups tend to try to stick together or eschew the other religious groups. So these governments have to deal sometimes with challenges to the efficient allocation model because the tribes within their countries, the ethnic groups, the cliques, the religious groups, the whatever groups there are, may view things differently than the country leaders do. And as I said, countries are countries, individuals within that country are individuals. So even if the leadership in that country views it one way, doesn't mean that all the people in that country do. So we in one country may look at another country and think they are that country. That's the way they think. But if you learn the culture of that country, they may have 10 or 11 different religious groups or ethnic groups, and they find their kinship more with people of their ethnic group or kinship in a bordering country. So this is one of the challenges to globalization and politics and where they kind of come together.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Lastly, what are some of the solutions to the challenges associated with globalization?
Well, we've talked about a lot of challenges, and there are a whole lot more than I'm sure if you had people stand around and talk, you'd hear a lot more. Solutions are very challenging, again, because you're looking at individual behavior instead of just group behavior. As far as a country saying, this is the mandate, this is what we're going to do, we're going to stand by it, we're going to all do the right thing. It's like a contract. That's the challenge. So, I don't have a clear answer, but I do have a suggestion. And that is, one doesn't necessarily resolve problems. Sometimes they mitigate those problems. And when it comes to globalization, a lot of the assumptions about globalization, working together, making sure everybody's efficient, they do make a lot of sense, but they're restricted because you're trying to apply this logic around the whole world. So what I would suggest, something that may mitigate some of the negatives associated with globalization, is regionalization. So what's the difference? Instead of trying to necessarily enforce laws or rules, regulations, and agreements worldwide, it may be in regions. So when we talk about, like I just said, about the ethnic issues, if you have two countries and the ethnic peoples live on either side of the border of those two countries, as a country, this ethnic group may not agree with their leadership because they have the ethnic ties to those people, half of whom are on the other country next door. But if you have a regional view instead of a world view, now instead of it being two separate countries, it's more of a region. And so what it does is it makes it easier to come to agreement with a smaller group of people who have more in common.
And would you compare this to the European Union and NAFTA?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk NAFTA. NAFTA is a lot more complicated, but the European Union concept, I think, is a good example where they are trying to say we have so much in common and our geographic borders make it difficult sometimes to be efficient, so let's try to bring those down. But they recognize that if they came to agreements within the European Union, and then they said, wow, this is working well, let's take it and have the people in Latin America go by these same rules, they might have a problem because the Latin Americans have different interests, different things that they consider important, different goals, different cultures. So, yes, that's a good analogy right there. Whereas Latin America may need to have their own regional union with their commonalities. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't have the World Trade Organization or the global way of looking at it, but I'm just saying when we have situations where we just cannot come to agreement worldwide because our interests are so disparate, then maybe regionalization reduces the chance of having disinterested parties or parties feeling like this isn't helping us, so why should we agree to it? I'm always careful about picking specific real examples because of the countries involved. But let's take fishing the seas. Some countries say, hey, if we continue the way we are, our sharks and some of our other fish are going to go extinct. So some of these countries want to have very strict rules regarding fishing certain sea creatures, whereas some other countries where they consume a lot more fish products, they have a problem with those rules. So this is one where regionalization may work better, that within that region where there's high consumption, they may have more lenient rules than the area where there's less consumption, and where there's less consumption, they may have hard and fast rules, and they may be able to stick by those rules because those people pretty much agree. But if we try to take these rules and apply them over there, where you have the people who like the consumption of seafood or sea products, they're never going to agree. So if you don't agree, what are you going to do? That's where the organized crime kicks in. That's where the government corruption kicks in, because I pay off the leaders in my country to let me do something that's contrary to the laws. So that's why I'm saying this is not necessarily a solution, but it's a mitigating opportunity, I think, to look at regionalization in many cases as opposed to just the total globalization concept.
Okay. Thank you so much about the conversation that we had today surrounding globalization and trade. It was nice speaking with you. Thank you.
All right, I enjoyed it. Thank you.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.